Hey there! Tonight, in this episode of Nocturnal Notions, we're going back. Further back than most stories dare to reach, to a time when the world was still being decided, when gods walked the earth in disguise, when monsters waited in the dark of labyrinths, and when the line between the human and the divine was thin enough to step across, if you knew where to look. What you're about to hear is the world of ancient Greece, not as a history lesson, not as a lecture, but as a long, slow, unhurried journey through some of the most remarkable stories ever told. We'll move through the very beginning of things, when a father swallowed his children and a mother wrapped a stone in blankets and changed the course of the cosmos. We'll spend time with gods who were strange and brilliant and deeply, fascinatingly flawed. We'll descend into the underworld, walk the roads that heroes walked, and linger in the quiet corners of mythology where transformation happens, where grief becomes a tree, where a voice becomes an echo, where a handful of reeds becomes music. These stories have been told for more than 2,000 years. People have carried them across oceans and centuries, through the collapse of empires and the rise of new ones, and they are still here, still resonant, still strange, still worth sitting with in the dark. If this kind of soft, wandering storytelling is something you'd like to return to, more long nights, more ancient worlds, more stories told slowly and with care, then a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this channel bring more of that to you. It takes only a moment, and it means these stories can keep reaching people who need a quiet place to land at the end of a long day. And if you'd like to leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are, please do. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing that people across the world are settling into the same story at the same time, each in their own dark room, each in their own stillness. So, get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go. Whatever it held, it's done now, and it can wait. We're going a long way back tonight. And we're in no hurry at all. Before the world as we know it took shape, before the mountains rose and the oceans settled into their great, quiet depths, there was chaos. And from that chaos, something ancient and powerful began to stir. The earliest stories of Greek mythology don't begin with heroes or monsters, though those will come in time. They begin with something far more primal, a family, and the terrible fear of a father. His name was Cronus. A titan, one of the great primordial beings who ruled the cosmos long before the Olympian gods ever drew breath. Cronus was powerful beyond measure, and cunning too. But power, as it so often does, brought with it a creeping, relentless paranoia. For Cronus had heard a prophecy, whispered by the fates themselves, that one of his own children would one day rise up and overthrow him, just as he had once overthrown his own father, Uranus. And so Cronus made a decision that was equal parts desperate and monstrous. He would swallow each of his children the moment they were born. His wife, the Titan Rhea, bore him child after child. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. And one by one, Cronus took each newborn and swallowed them whole. It is one of the most striking images in all of mythology, this towering, ancient figure, ruler of the cosmos, undone not by any enemy but by his own consuming fear. The children did not die. They could not. They were immortal. They simply waited, in the darkness inside their father, patient as seeds buried under winter frost. But Rhea had grown tired of her grief. When the time came for her sixth child to be born, she made a plan. She traveled to the island of Crete and gave birth there in secret, in a deep cave on the slopes of Mount Ida. The child was a boy. She named him Zeus. And rather than hand him to his father, she wrapped a large stone in swaddling blankets, carried it back to Cronus, and presented it to him as the newborn. Cronus, satisfied and unsuspecting, swallowed the stone without a second thought. It is a small, quiet moment in the grand sweep of cosmic history, a mother's love and a clever deception, and yet it changed everything. Young Zeus was kept hidden in that cave on Crete, cradled and protected. But there was still the matter of keeping him secret. A crying infant, even a divine one, could give everything away. And so the cave was guarded by a remarkable group known as the Curettes, a band of young warriors whose task was both sacred and wonderfully strange. Whenever the baby Zeus began to cry, the Curettes would dance around the entrance of the cave, beating their shields with their spears, clashing and clanging and making a tremendous racket. The noise of their dancing drowned out the infant's cries completely, so that the sound never reached Cronus's ears. It is one of mythology's more endearing details, armed soldiers, dancing in the dark to protect a sleeping god. And there is another detail, stranger still, that some ancient traditions preserve. The cradle where Zeus slept was said to have been hung from a tree, suspended in the air so that the child rested neither on the earth, nor over the sea, nor under the open sky. He existed in the spaces between. In this way, it was believed, he could not be detected by his father, who searched all realms but could not find him in the places that had no name. Zeus grew. He grew strong and wise and, in time, full of purpose. With the help of the Titan Metis, he gave Cronus a drink laced with an emetic, and Cronus, that great, fearful, swallowing god, vomited up every child he had consumed. Out they came, one by one, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia. Fully grown, immortal, and very, very ready for war. What followed was a 10-year conflict that shook the very foundations of the cosmos. The Olympians on one side, the Titans on the other. The battle was called the Titanomachy, and it raged across the heavens and the earth with a ferocity that ancient writers struggled to put into words. But Zeus had one great advantage. Deep beneath the earth, imprisoned since the days of Uranus, were beings of tremendous power who had never been given their freedom, the Cyclopes, those great one-eyed giants who were, among other things, the finest smiths the world has ever known. Zeus freed them, and in gratitude, the Cyclopes got to work. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, that crackling, blinding weapon of divine fire that would become his eternal symbol. For Poseidon, they made the trident, that three-pronged spear capable of splitting the earth and stirring the seas into fury. For Hades, a helmet of darkness that made its wearer invisible. 3 weapons, 3 brothers, and with them, the tide of war turned completely. The Titans were defeated. Cronus and his allies were cast down into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, bound there in chains beneath the earth. And with their victory, the 6 children of Cronus, and their own children and allies, took their place as the rulers of the cosmos. 12 of them would come to be called the Olympians, and they made their home atop the highest peak in all of Greece, Mount Olympus, whose summit was said to rest among the clouds, untouched by wind or rain, bathed always in golden light. It is a story about cycles, about power passed from father to child, about fear that tries to swallow the future whole, and about the stubborn way the future finds a way to survive anyway. A stone wrapped in a blanket. A group of dancing soldiers. A baby in a suspended cradle, hidden between worlds. From these small, tender things, the age of the Olympians began. The Olympians had won their war. They had claimed the cosmos, divided it among themselves, and settled into the golden ease of divine rule. But if you imagine them as distant, serene figures, perfect and untouchable, gazing down at the world with calm, celestial eyes, then Greek mythology has a great deal to tell you. Because the gods of Olympus were, in almost every meaningful sense, magnificently, wonderfully strange. They argued and schemed. They fell in love and held grudges. They made decisions that no reasonable being would defend. And their lives, for all their immortal splendor, were tangled and surprising in ways that feel, even now, startlingly human. Let us begin with the headache. Not just any headache, of course. This was Zeus, king of the gods, lord of thunder, and so naturally, his headache was of cosmic proportions. The pain was so immense, so blinding and relentless, that Zeus cried out across Olympus for relief. And the one who answered was Hephaestus, the god of the forge, divine craftsman and smith. The solution he proposed was, to put it gently, unconventional. He raised his axe and split Zeus's skull open. And from that wound, fully formed and already armored for battle, stepped Athena, goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and crafts. She did not arrive as a newborn. She did not grow slowly into her power. She emerged complete, her gray eyes open and clear, a spear already in her hand. It is one of the most arresting birth stories in all of mythology, and it tells you something important about Athena from the very beginning. She was never going to be anything less than whole. She would go on to become one of the most beloved of all the Olympians, and her relationship with the city of Athens is perhaps her most famous story. The city needed a patron god, a divine protector, and both Athena and Poseidon wanted the honor. And so a contest was held, witnessed by the people themselves. Poseidon went first. He raised his great trident, that iconic three-pronged weapon, symbol of his dominion over all the waters of the world, not just the sea but every river, spring, and storm-swollen lake, and he drove it into the rock of the Acropolis. From the stone gushed a spring of water. The crowd leaned in. Then they tasted it. Salt. The water was salt water, as briny and undrinkable as the sea itself. Athena stepped forward. She knelt, pressed her hands to the earth, and from the soil grew an olive tree, silver-leafed and quiet, bearing fruit that could be eaten, pressed for oil, burned for light, and traded for wealth. The people of the city chose the olive tree. They chose Athena. And the city took her name, Athens, which it carries still, more than 2,000 years later. Poseidon, it should be noted, was not a gracious loser. But then, the gods rarely were. Athens also carries another, stranger story in its earliest mythology. There was a king, or rather, a creature who became a king, named Erichthonius. His origins are complicated even by mythological standards, but what matters here is that when he was born, he was not entirely human. From the waist down, Erichthonius was a serpent, his lower half a coil of scales that he kept carefully hidden beneath his robes when he eventually ruled. Athena, who held a particular tenderness for Athens and its people, took the infant Erichthonius under her protection. She placed him in a chest, a small, sealed box, and gave it to the daughters of the Athenian king for safekeeping, warning them never to open it. Two of the daughters, overcome with curiosity, opened the chest anyway. What they saw drove them mad, and they leapt from the cliffs of the Acropolis. Erichthonius survived, went on to become one of Athens's greatest early kings, and is credited with inventing the chariot. The chest, the secret, the serpent coiled inside, it is one of those myths that feels more like a dream than a story, vivid and just slightly out of reach. Now, Poseidon lost the contest for Athens, but his trident remained one of the great symbols of divine power. He ruled not merely the ocean but all waters everywhere, every river that carved through rock, every underground spring that bubbled up in a meadow, every storm that poured down from the sky and flooded the plains. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage. Earthquakes were said to be caused by his trident striking the seafloor. He was, in many ways, one of the most powerful of all the Olympians, and certainly one of the most volatile. But for sheer unpredictability, it is hard to surpass his brother Zeus. Zeus was, among many other things, a deity who seemed constitutionally incapable of staying in one form. He appeared to mortal women disguised as a great white bull, gentle and beautiful, luring them close before revealing his true nature. He came as an eagle, vast and golden against the sky. He descended as a shower of golden light, slipping through the cracks of stone and shadow. Each disguise, each encounter, added another thread to the already enormously tangled family tapestry of Greek mythology, demigods and heroes born of these unions, each carrying a piece of the divine, each eventually finding their way into their own extraordinary story. Then there is Aphrodite, who has the rare distinction of having not one but two completely different origin stories, both preserved in ancient texts and both told with equal conviction. In the older tradition, she arose from the sea itself, born from the white foam that gathered around the severed form of Uranus where it fell into the ocean. She drifted to shore on a shell or carried by the waves, already breathtaking, already the embodiment of love and beauty and desire. In a later tradition, she is simply the daughter of Zeus and a titan named Dion, born as other gods are born, in the more conventional divine manner. Ancient writers seem unbothered by the contradiction. Perhaps for the goddess of love, the mystery of her origins only adds to her power. Apollo is many things: god of the sun, of music, of prophecy, of healing and poetry and light, and he is, by most accounts, one of the most gifted of all the Olympians. He is also, under the right circumstances, one of the most easily offended. King Midas of Phrygia discovered this firsthand. Midas had already had one brush with divine consequence. He was the king who wished that everything he touched would turn to gold, and very nearly starved and wept his way to death before the wish was reversed. But Midas had not quite learned the lesson that wisdom might have taught him. When Apollo was set against the satyr Marsyas in a music contest, and the judges declared Apollo the winner, Midas alone had the bravado, or perhaps the poor judgment, to disagree. He said out loud, in front of the god of music himself, that he thought Marsyas had played better. Apollo turned and looked at him. And then, with quiet, elegant contempt, the god gave Midas a pair of ears to match the quality of his musical opinion. Donkey ears. Long, grey, and entirely unmistakable. Midas spent the rest of his life wearing elaborate hats and turbans to hide his shame, confiding the secret only to his barber, who whispered it into a hole in the ground, from which, inevitably, reeds grew and murmured the truth to anyone who passed. Before Apollo became so fully associated with the sun, there was another, older, perhaps more elemental. His name was Helios, and every single day without exception, he climbed into a blazing golden chariot drawn by fire-breathing horses and drove the sun across the sky from east to west. He rose each morning from his palace in the east, arced across the heavens through the long blue hours of day, and descended each evening into the ocean in the west, where a golden cup waited to carry him back around the underside of the world through the night, ready to begin again at dawn. The Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a statue so enormous that ships were said to sail between its legs, was built in his honor, a monument to the god who kept the light of the world on its daily course. Helios had a son named Phaeton, and Phaeton had a problem that many children share. He desperately needed his father to believe in him. Some of the other boys had taunted him, laughing at his claim that the sun-driver was his father. Wounded and burning with the need to prove himself, Phaeton went to Helios and asked for one thing, just one, to show the world who his father truly was. He wanted to drive the sun chariot. Helios, to his credit, tried to refuse. He explained, gently and then urgently, that the horses were wild beyond imagining, that the path was treacherous, that even Zeus himself did not drive that route. But he had made a promise. And so, with a father's terrified reluctance, he let his son take the reins. It did not go well. Phaeton lost control almost immediately. The horses, sensing an unfamiliar hand, bolted, first too high, so that the earth grew cold and dark, and then swooping terrifyingly low, so that the heat scorched the land below into bare, cracked desert. The earth cried out. Rivers boiled away. The great forests burned. Libya became the Sahara. The sun veered and careened across the sky in a wild, burning arc. Zeus, watching the destruction unfold, made a swift and brutal decision. He raised his thunderbolt and struck Phaeton from the chariot. The boy fell, blazing, into the river Eridanus below. His sisters, the Heliades, wept for him so long and so inconsolably that the gods eventually transformed them into poplar trees on the riverbank, their tears hardening into drops of amber as they fell. It is a story about longing, about the gap between what we wish we could do and what we are actually prepared for. Phaeton didn't want to burn the world. He simply wanted his father to be proud of him. And the world, indifferent to that tender, entirely human wish, scorched anyway. There is a river that runs through the Greek underworld called the Lethe. Its name means forgetfulness. The souls of the dead were said to drink from it before they were reborn, washing away every memory of the life they had lived, every face they had loved, every sorrow they had carried, every small and ordinary moment that had once felt like the whole world. They drank, and they forgot, and they began again. It is, perhaps, the most quietly haunting detail in all of Greek mythology. Not the monsters or the punishments or the vast dark geography of the realm below, but that river. That forgetting. The idea that what waits beyond death is not judgment or fire, but simply the slow, gentle erasure of everything you were. Let us descend, then. Carefully, because the underworld of the ancient Greeks is far stranger and more nuanced than most people realize, and it begins with a misconception worth correcting. Hades was not the god of death. This surprises people, because his name is so thoroughly bound up with the idea of death in the popular imagination. But in the Greek tradition, Hades was something more specific and, in a way, more interesting. He was the ruler of the underworld, the king of the realm of the dead, but death itself, the actual act and force of dying, belonged to someone else entirely. Hades governed the place where souls went. He did not come for them. He did not stand at the moment of final breath. He simply presided, impassive and absolute, over what arrived in his kingdom. The god of death, the actual personification of the ending of life, was Thanatos. He was one of the primordial beings, born of Night herself, and he moved through the world quietly, without drama, a figure of dark wings and a gentle face. Ancient poets sometimes described him as peaceful, even beautiful, a soft release rather than a violent one. He was the twin brother of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and the two of them were imagined as natural companions, death and sleep, night and rest, the two great surrenders that mortals make. One temporary, one permanent. It is worth pausing on that, the idea that the Greeks gave death its own deity separate from the ruler of the underworld. It reflects something important about how they understood these forces. Hades was not cruel in the way of a monster. He was simply inexorable. He ran a realm administered by rules, and those rules were as fixed and fair as any in the cosmos. Almost no one who entered his kingdom ever left it. Not because Hades was vindictive, but because that was simply the nature of his domain. He was, in many ancient accounts, one of the more just and consistent of the Olympians, which is perhaps why he was also one of the most feared. There is something more unsettling about an impartial judge than a passionate one. The geography of the underworld was its own vast, layered world. And here is something curious. In Greek, the word Hades referred both to the god and to his realm. The ruler and the ruled shared a name. The same is true of Tartarus, a being so ancient he predates most of the gods, and also the name of the deepest, darkest pit of the underworld, the place where the defeated titans were chained and where the most severe punishments were carried out. These are not coincidences. They reflect a very old way of thinking, in which a god and the domain they inhabit are not truly separate things. The god does not merely rule the place. In some essential sense, the god is the place. And at the entrance to this place stood Cerberus. He is perhaps mythology's most famous guardian, and he earns the reputation. Cerberus was a dog, but the word dog does very little justice to what he actually was. He had 3 heads, each capable of independent and ferocious attention, so that nothing could approach the gate of the underworld from any angle without being seen. His tail was that of a serpent, long and scaled and dangerous. And from his back, according to some ancient sources, sprouted additional serpents, a writhing, hissing array of them along his spine, making him as much a creature of nightmare as of nature. He was not there to keep the living out, though he served that purpose incidentally. His primary function was to keep the dead in. Souls could enter. They could not leave. Cerberus made certain of that. The few heroes who ever managed to slip past him, Heracles, Orpheus, Psyche, did so with methods ranging from brute strength to the almost unbearable tenderness of a lullaby. Deeper into this world, past the rivers and the plains and the judgment halls, there was a cave. In that cave lived Hypnos, the god of sleep, twin to Thanatos, son of night. His home was described as a place of absolute and total darkness, where the sun never reached and no sound entered. Through it flowed the river Lethe, that river of forgetfulness, its water murmuring softly through the dark. Hypnos himself reclined there, surrounded by poppy flowers, drifting in and out of his own domain. He was a gentle deity, on the whole. Even the gods were cautious about waking him. Even Zeus, on at least one occasion, was put to sleep by Hypnos's touch, which tells you something about the nature of sleep, that it submits to no hierarchy, bows to no authority. It comes for gods and kings and heroes alike, and it does not ask permission. But the underworld was not the only realm of the strange and the liminal. There were forces that dwelt not below the earth but in the in-between spaces of the world above, in doorways, at crossroads, in the hour just after dark when the day has ended but the night has not quite taken hold. Hecate was one of these. She is one of the oldest and most complex figures in all of Greek religion, a goddess of crossroads and thresholds, of the night and of ghosts, of magic and the hidden knowledge that lives at the edges of things. She was often depicted carrying 2 torches, one in each hand, illuminating the places where paths diverge. Crossroads were sacred to her because they are places of decision, of ambiguity. You are not yet where you are going, but you have already left where you were. That liminal quality, that in-betweenness, was Hecate's particular territory. Offerings were left for her at crossroads at night. Dogs, sacred to her, would howl when she was near. She moved through the world at the margins, and the margins, in the Greek imagination, were some of the most powerful places of all. Among the spirits that attended Hecate was one of the more genuinely unsettling figures in Greek mythology. Her name was Empusa, and she was a shapeshifter, a creature capable of taking on many forms, from a beautiful woman to something far more monstrous. She was associated with seduction and terror in equal measure, and she had one feature that remained consistent across her many shapes: One leg was made of bronze, or sometimes said to be that of a donkey, while the other was an ordinary human leg. This asymmetry, this wrongness in her form, was perhaps part of what made her so frightening. She was almost right, almost human. And in mythology, as in life, the almost human is often more disturbing than the entirely inhuman. She was sent, in some stories, to frighten travelers at night on lonely roads. Heroes who encountered her were advised to shout insults at her, which, remarkably, was said to cause her to flee in shame or confusion. It is one of mythology's stranger pieces of practical advice. And then, softer than all of this, there is one final figure worth meeting here, one who arrived not from the Greek imagination alone but was adopted into it from somewhere older and further away. His name, in the Greek form, was Harpocrates. He had come originally from Egypt, where he was a version of the young Horus, the child god who held one finger to his lips, a gesture that, in Egyptian iconography, simply indicated youth. But the Greeks, encountering this image, interpreted it as something else. They saw in that finger-to-lips gesture the universal signal for silence, for secrets kept, for knowledge withheld. And so Harpocrates became their god of silence, the divine personification of the things left unsaid, the whispers not given voice, the mysteries held quietly in the dark. It is from his name that we get the word Harpocratic, meaning sworn to silence. And it is from this small borrowed god, this gentle child with his finger pressed to his mouth, that one of our most enduring gestures was given its meaning. Shush. Even the gods, sometimes, knew when to keep their secrets. There is a particular kind of story that Greek mythology tells better than almost any other tradition, the story of what happens when a human being reaches too far. When a mortal, brilliant or desperate or simply proud, steps across a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. These stories are not simple cautionary tales. They are richer and stranger than that. Because the Greeks understood that the most interesting transgressions are usually committed for reasons that make a certain kind of sense. The fire is stolen not for power or glory, but because people are cold. The jar is opened not out of malice, but out of the entirely human inability to leave a mystery alone. Let us begin with fire, and with the God who loved humanity enough to suffer for it without end. His name was Prometheus. He was a titan, one of the old beings who predated the Olympians, and he was gifted with a particular kind of foresight, his name itself meaning something close to forethought. While the gods of Olympus regarded humanity with varying degrees of interest and indifference, Prometheus looked down at the small, cold, vulnerable creatures on the earth below and felt something that the Olympians, for all their power, often seemed to lack. He felt something like compassion. And so he gave. He gave more, in fact, than is usually remembered. Prometheus did not only steal fire from the gods and carry it down to humanity in a hollow fennel stalk, though he did that, and it is rightly considered one of the great acts of mythological defiance. He also taught. He taught humans architecture, how to shape stone and wood into shelters that could stand against the cold and the rain. He taught them medicine, the rudiments of healing, how to read the body's signals and answer them. He taught them writing, that most transformative of all human technologies, the ability to fix thought into form, to send a message across time itself. In some traditions, he taught them mathematics, navigation, metalworking, and the reading of signs in nature. He was, in these accounts, not merely a thief of fire but the great educator of the human race, the divine figure who looked at what humanity could be and helped it get there. Zeus was furious. And Zeus's punishments, when they came, were thorough. Prometheus was chained to a rock on a mountainside at the edge of the world. Each day, an eagle, some say sent by Zeus himself, some say an embodiment of divine wrath, descended and ate his liver. And each night, because Prometheus was immortal and could not die, the liver grew back, so that the next morning the eagle could return. And the next. And the next. It went on, in some accounts, for 30,000 years, until Heracles finally came and freed him. It is one of mythology's most enduring images of suffering born from love, a being who knew exactly what his gift would cost him and gave it anyway. Into this newly warmed and educated human world came a woman named Pandora. She was the first woman, in the Greek tradition, crafted by Hephaestus from clay at Zeus's instruction, shaped and gifted by each of the Olympians in turn. Aphrodite gave her beauty, Hermes gave her curiosity and persuasion, Athena dressed her and taught her skills. She was, in every sense, a divine creation. And she came with a gift of her own, a large storage jar, sealed and heavy, which she had been told never to open. Now, and this is worth knowing, it was never a box. The word in the original Greek is pithos, which describes a large clay jar, the kind used for storing grain or oil or wine, taller than a person and sealed at the top. It became a box centuries later due to a translation error made by the Renaissance scholar Erasmus, who confused pithos with the Greek word pyxis, meaning a small box. The mistake stuck, and Pandora's box has remained a box in the popular imagination ever since. But in the original telling, it was a jar, vast and sealed and full of something that had never been let into the world before. Pandora opened it. Of course she did. Curiosity of that particular, irresistible kind, the curiosity attached to the one thing you have been told you must not touch, is perhaps the most human quality there is. Out came everything that had been locked inside: illness and grief, jealousy, spite, old age, suffering of every kind, all of it rising like smoke into the clear air of the world. Pandora slammed the lid back down as quickly as she could, but it was far too late. Almost everything had escaped. Almost. Because at the very bottom of the jar, when she finally looked again, one thing remained: hope. Whether that makes the story a consolation or a cruelty depends on how you read it. Hope survived, but only just, and only because it was the last thing inside, the one that nearly got away with the rest. Far to the south, on the island of Crete, another kind of consequence was taking shape. The Minotaur, perhaps the most iconic monster in all of Greek mythology, was not born from divine wrath or cosmic accident, but from a very specific chain of cause and effect rooted in pride and broken promises. King Minos of Crete had prayed to Poseidon for a magnificent white bull as a sign of divine favor, promising to sacrifice it in the god's honor. The bull arrived, gleaming and perfect. And Minos, unable to part with such a beautiful animal, substituted a lesser bull for the sacrifice and kept the white one for himself. Poseidon's response was, by divine standards, extraordinarily creative in its cruelty. He caused Minos's wife, Pasiphae, to fall into an unnatural obsession with the bull. The creature that resulted from this union was the Minotaur, a being with the powerful body of a man and the head and shoulders of a bull, violent and enormous and entirely without a place in the world. Minos had the great craftsman Daedalus construct an elaborate labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos, a maze of such complexity that even its architect struggled to find his way back out, and the Minotaur was placed inside it. In the darkness. Alone. Fed, in some accounts, on the young men and women sent as tribute from Athens, 7 boys and 7 girls every 9 years. Until Theseus came, and Ariadne gave him a thread, and the labyrinth finally yielded its secret. The Gorgons were 3 sisters, Stheno, Uriel, and Medusa, beings so terrible that the mere sight of their faces turned any living creature to stone. 2 of the 3 were immortal. Medusa was not. and that mortality was precisely what made Perseus's task possible. He came for her with a mirrored shield, watching her reflection rather than looking directly at her, and severed her head with a divine blade while she slept. From her blood, as it hit the earth, sprang two remarkable beings, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chryse. But Medusa had not always been a monster. In the tradition preserved by the Roman poet Ovid, which has become, for many readers, the most haunting version of her story, she had begun as a mortal woman of extraordinary beauty, a priestess in the temple of Athena. Something terrible happened to her there, an act of violence from which she could not flee. And Athena, rather than offer protection, transformed Medusa into the creature she became, snakes for hair, a face that petrified, a body that could no longer be approached. Whether this transformation was punishment or, in some darker reading, a kind of terrible armor, a protection so extreme it became its own prison, is something the ancient texts leave unanswered. It is a story that has never stopped resonating. And perhaps that is because it refuses to be comfortable. Among mortals who ran afoul of the gods, Ixion stands at a particular and grim extreme. He was, in the Greek tradition, the first human being to murder a family member, a crime so new and so horrifying that no one quite knew what to do with it at first. Zeus, in an act of extraordinary mercy, actually purified him of the crime and invited him to Olympus. Ixion repaid this kindness by attempting to seduce Hera, Zeus's wife. Zeus, to test whether his suspicions were correct, fashioned a cloud in Hera's shape and sent it in her place. Ixion embraced the cloud and believed himself to have succeeded. Zeus's patience, exhausted completely, came to an end. Ixion was bound to a great wheel of fire. Some accounts describe it as spinning in the sky, others as turning in the underworld, and that he was condemned to remain, eternally rotating, for the rest of time. The image of a man strapped to a wheel of flame, endlessly turning, is one of mythology's starkest pictures of divine punishment, not just suffering, but an endless, disorienting, purposeless suffering, going nowhere, arriving nowhere, forever. Then there is Erysichthon, whose offense was simpler and whose punishment was arguably the most viscerally disturbing of all. He was a king who, in a fit of arrogant practicality, decided to cut down a sacred grove, the ancient trees beloved of the goddess Demeter, because he needed the lumber for a new banquet hall. His men were reluctant. One tree, when struck, reportedly bled and cried out. Erysichthon cut it down himself. Demeter's response was to visit upon him a hunger that could not be satisfied. He ate and ate and ate, consuming his entire estate, selling off his possessions to buy more food, never for a single moment feeling anything other than a ravenous, clawing, endless need. He eventually sold his own daughter into slavery to feed himself. And when there was nothing left, nothing and no one, Erysichthon turned to the only resource that remained. He began to consume himself. Limb by limb, the hunger took him until there was nothing left at all. Tantalus, by contrast, arrived at his punishment through a crime of deliberate cruelty rather than impulsive destruction. He had been granted the extraordinary privilege of dining with the gods, welcomed at the table of the Olympians as though he were one of them. And in a gesture of such monstrous ingratitude that it is difficult to fully comprehend, he killed his own son Pelops, cooked him, and served him to the gods at a banquet, perhaps to test whether they truly were all-knowing, perhaps simply out of a darkness of character that the myth doesn't bother to explain. The gods knew immediately. All of them refused to eat. All but Demeter, who was lost in grief over Persephone and, in her distraction, ate a piece of the shoulder. Pelops was restored to life, his missing shoulder replaced with one of ivory. And Tantalus was sent to the underworld, where he was placed in a pool of cool water, beneath the boughs of trees heavy with fruit. Whenever he bent to drink, the water receded. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches lifted away. For eternity, he stood surrounded by the things he needed, unable to ever touch them. The word we still use for this particular exquisite frustration, tantalize, carries his name quietly inside it, across more than 2,000 years. And finally, there is Lycaon, king of Arcadia, skeptic of divinity, architect of what may be mythology's most alarming dinner party. When Zeus came to him disguised as a traveler, Lycaon was determined to test whether his guest was truly a god. His method of testing was to serve Zeus a meal containing human flesh. Some accounts say it was the flesh of a prisoner. Some say it was something worse. Zeus, in any case, was not fooled and was not amused. He destroyed the palace with a thunderbolt and turned to Lycaon himself. Lycaon fled, ran out into the night, and as he ran, the transformation overtook him. His clothes became fur. His arms became legs. His face extended into a muzzle, his voice into a howl. He became a wolf, sprinting across the Arcadian hills, with all of a wolf's hunger and none of a man's restraint. He was, in the Greek tradition, the very first werewolf. The original. The template for every story that came after, of humans who slip their humanity when the moon is right and something ancient rises up through the skin. What unites all of these figures, Prometheus and Pandora, the Minotaur and Medusa, Ixion and Erysichthon and Tantalus and Lycaon, is not simply transgression. It is the weight of consequence. The Greek mythological world was one in which actions carried meaning that extended far beyond the individual. What you did echoed. It shaped the world. It created words we still speak, named feelings we still feel, explained landscapes we still walk through. The fire was stolen. The jar was opened. The grove was cut. The meal was served. And the world became, in each case, slightly different than it had been before. It always does. Every culture has its heroes. But the heroes of ancient Greece occupy a particular place in the imagination, not because they were the strongest or the bravest or the most virtuous, though many of them were all of those things at various moments. They occupy that place because they were also, so often, deeply and recognizably flawed. They loved the wrong people. They made catastrophic decisions. They carried the weight of divine interference in their lives like a stone tied around the ankle, and they walked forward anyway. The Greek hero is not a perfect figure set apart from humanity. The Greek hero is humanity, extended to its outermost limits, tested until the point of breaking, and observed, with unflinching attention, to see what survives. Let us begin at the edges of the known world, with a nation of warriors that the Greeks both feared and admired, and could not quite decide whether to believe in. The Amazons were a legendary society of female warriors, skilled riders, fierce fighters, devoted to the goddess Artemis, living without the governance of men in a distant land beyond the boundaries of the familiar world. In Greek art, they appear again and again, in battle against heroes, in friezes on temples, in stories that treat them with a mixture of respect and unease. For a long time they were considered entirely mythological. But archaeology has complicated that assumption. Excavations of burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe, the vast grasslands that stretch from Eastern Europe deep into Central Asia, have uncovered the remains of women buried with weapons, with armor, with the bowed legs of lifelong horse riders. Women who, by the evidence of their bones, had fought and hunted. The Greek stories of the Amazons, it turns out, may have been inspired by real cultures, the Scythians and their neighbors, in which women rode and fought alongside men. The legend and the reality met somewhere out on those wide, windswept plains, and the result was one of mythology's most enduring images. From the edges of the world, then, to its center, because no conversation about Greek heroes can travel very far without arriving at Heracles. He is the greatest of them all, by almost any measure. The strongest mortal who ever lived, the hero who defined what a hero was, the figure whose story became the template for hero narratives across cultures and centuries. And yet, here is a detail that surprises many people. Heracles was not his original name. He was born Alcides, named for his grandfather Alcaeus. The name Heracles came later, given to him in an attempt to appease the goddess Hera, whose name is woven into his own. It did not work. Hera, who hated Heracles with a passionate and enduring fury rooted in his very existence as Zeus's son by a mortal woman, would torment him for the entirety of his life, from the snake she sent into his cradle when he was an infant, which he strangled with his bare hands, because even as a baby Heracles was Heracles, to the madness she eventually drove him into, during which he committed an act of violence so terrible that its aftermath became the engine of his most famous stories. The 12 labors were the penance for that act. Set by King Eurystheus of Tiryns, who was himself a puppet of Hera's scheming, each labor was designed to be impossible. The first was to kill the Nemean lion, a creature whose hide was impervious to any weapon, whose skin could not be pierced by arrow or blade. Heracles killed it with his bare hands and wore its skin ever after as armor, since the hide that could not be cut could also not be cut away from him by any lesser means. The sixth labor required him to clean the Augean stables, the accumulated filth of thousands of cattle, undisturbed for decades, a task so monumentally disgusting that it was presumably considered beneath the dignity of heroic effort. Heracles solved it not with a shovel but with engineering. He diverted 2 rivers directly through the stables and let the water do the work in a single day. It is one of mythology's most satisfying problem-solving moments, a hero who understood that strength is not always the most efficient tool. The labors sent him to the ends of the earth and beyond it, to the garden of the Hesperides at the edge of the world, down into the underworld itself to retrieve Cerberus, across the sea to the lands of the Amazons. He completed every one. And when the labors were done, his story continued, as sprawling and extraordinary as ever, until his death on a burning pyre on Mount Oeta, from which, in the tradition that felt most true to his nature, he ascended to Olympus and became a god himself. Even death, in the end, could not quite contain him. While Heracles remade the world through force and endurance, another hero was making his name through a different kind of courage, strategic, curious, willing to engage with the strangeness of the world rather than simply overpower it. His name was Theseus, and before he ever descended into the labyrinth at Crete, he had already spent his journey to Athens becoming the kind of hero he needed to be. The road from Troezen to Athens was, in those early days, not a safe one. It was populated with a remarkable collection of bandits and monsters who had developed highly specific and deeply unpleasant methods of dealing with travelers. One of the most memorable was a man named Siren, who controlled a narrow coastal path along the cliffs, one of those places where the rock drops sharply to the sea and there is no way around, only through. Siren's particular practice was to stop travelers and demand that they wash his feet. It was a gesture of total submission and humiliation, framed as a request. Those who complied knelt before him on the cliff's edge, and Siren kicked them over. Below, in the water, a giant sea turtle waited, and had been waiting for a very long time. Theseus, when he arrived at that narrow path, did not wash Siren's feet. Instead, with a move of such elegant simplicity that it has the quality of a punchline, he picked Siren up and threw him off the cliff himself. The sea turtle, presumably, was not particular about direction. There were others on that road, Procrusts, who had a bed he insisted every traveler fit exactly, and who either stretched them or cut them to size. Cines, who bent pine trees down and used them as catapults. Circean, who wrestled passers-by to their deaths. Theseus dealt with each of them, generally using their own methods against them, and arrived in Athens as something the city had not quite had before, a hero of its own, shaped not by divine parentage alone but by the particular, accumulated experience of a dangerous road taken without flinching. And then came Crete, and the labyrinth, and the Minotaur waiting in the dark. He went as one of the tribute children, voluntarily, and he carried a sword. But it was Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who gave him the thing without which the sword would have been useless. She gave him a ball of thread, which he tied to the entrance of the labyrinth and paid out behind him as he walked deeper in. In the absolute darkness of that maze, with its endless identical corridors designed to disorient and exhaust, the thread was everything. It was the difference between a hero and a corpse. He found the Minotaur. He killed it. And he found his way back out by following the thread back to the light. It is, at its heart, a story about not losing the way home. About keeping, even in the deepest darkness, that one slender connection to the world you came from. While the heroes of the land carved their names into myth, the sea called to another generation of adventurers. The voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, named for the ship, the Argo, that carried them, is one of the oldest surviving heroic epics in the Western tradition, predating even Homer in some of its roots. Jason was the rightful heir to the kingdom of Iolcos, cheated of his birthright by his uncle Peleus, who agreed to return the throne on one impossible condition: that Jason retrieve the Golden Fleece, a mythical artifact kept at the far eastern edge of the known world, in the kingdom of Colchis on the shores of the Black Sea. The Argo was built. The crew assembled, and what a crew it was. Heracles was aboard for part of the voyage. So was Orpheus, who played his lyre to keep the rowers in time and who would later prove invaluable when the ship passed the island of the Sirens, countering their deadly music with something more beautiful still. Atalanta, in some accounts, was invited, a huntress of such extraordinary skill that her inclusion on a crew of heroes was entirely without question. Atalanta deserves her own moment here, because she is one of mythology's most singular figures. She had been abandoned on a mountainside at birth by a father who wanted a son, raised by a she-bear, and grown up into a hunter of exceptional ability, present at the Caledonian boar hunt, one of the great heroic events of the age, where she drew first blood on the boar while men who considered themselves her superiors were still organizing themselves. She was fast, too. Faster than any man she had ever faced. And she had made a decision: she would not marry anyone who could not outrun her. Those who tried and lost, and nearly all of them lost, paid with their lives. Hippomenes loved her and was not foolish enough to think he could simply outrun her on raw speed. Instead, he prayed to Aphrodite for help, and Aphrodite, who had a professional interest in these matters, gave him 3 golden apples from her sacred garden. When the race began and Atalanta surged ahead, as she always did, effortlessly, her speed a kind of natural law, Hippomenes rolled the first golden apple across her path. Atalanta, who despite everything was not immune to beauty or curiosity, slowed to pick it up. He gained ground. She caught up. He rolled the second apple. She slowed again, divided between the race and the gleaming thing rolling away across the grass. The third apple, rolled at exactly the right moment, finally cost her enough time that Hippomenes crossed the line first. She had been beaten not by speed or strength but by distraction. By 3 moments of entirely human hesitation in the face of something beautiful. Whether the marriage that followed was a happy one is, like many things in mythology, a complicated question, but the race itself has endured, perfectly constructed for thousands of years. And then there is Odysseus. He is not the strongest. He is not the most honorable by the conventional definitions of heroic honor. He is not even always the most admirable. But Odysseus is, without question, the most interesting hero in all of Greek mythology, and possibly in all of ancient literature. His defining quality, the thing the ancient poets return to again and again with something approaching reverence, is not his courage or his fighting ability, though he has both. It is his mind, his resourcefulness, his capacity for thinking sideways, for finding the solution that nobody else has seen, for surviving through intelligence in situations where intelligence should not be enough. He is the one who thought of the Trojan horse. He is the one who, stranded on the island of the Cyclops Polyphemus, blinded the monster with a sharpened stake and then escaped by hiding himself and his men under the bellies of the sheep as they left the cave, telling the Cyclops, before he escaped, that his name was Nobody, so that when Polyphemus cried out to the other Cyclopes that he had been hurt, he told them that nobody had harmed him, and they went back to sleep. He is the one who, offered immortality by the nymph Calypso, chose to return home to his mortal wife on a rocky island, because home, however imperfect, was real in a way that immortality was not. His journey home from Troy took 10 years. It took him past the Sirens and through the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, past the island of the sun god's sacred cattle, to the land of the dead and back. He arrived in Ithaca alone, having lost every ship and every man he set out with, not through cowardice or carelessness, but through the accumulated, relentless weight of divine opposition and mortal limitation. And yet he arrived. He always arrived. What the great heroes of Greek mythology share is not perfection but persistence, the refusal to stop even when the odds are cosmically, ludicrously stacked against them. Heracles born into an enemy's hatred, Theseus walking a road that should have killed him, Jason sailing to the end of the world, Atalanta running a race that no one had ever won, Odysseus choosing the long way home and surviving it. They do not succeed because the world is fair. The world of Greek mythology is very rarely fair. They succeed because they keep going. Because they find the thread in the dark and hold on to it. Because they roll a golden apple across the grass at exactly the right moment and hope. Not all of Greek mythology moves at the scale of cosmic war or heroic labor. Some of its most enduring stories are smaller than that, quieter, more intimate, turning on a single clever decision or a moment of cruelty or a love so complete that even death could not quite finish it. These are the stories that lived closest to the ground, told around fires and in marketplaces, passed from parent to child across generations. They are the stories that gave names to feelings and explained the shapes of things, why the reed makes music, why a certain stone holds the color of wine, why an echo follows you through the hills and always has the last word. They are also, sometimes, the stories of people who pushed against the gods themselves and found extraordinarily inventive ways to do it. Sisyphus was a king. He was also, by the consistent testimony of ancient writers, one of the craftiest and most unscrupulous human beings who ever lived, and in a mythology populated by deeply unscrupulous people, that is saying something considerable. He was a founder of cities and a breaker of rules, a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting any limitation placed on him, divine or otherwise. He cheated and schemed his way through life with a kind of gleeful energy that the gods found increasingly difficult to tolerate. But it was his treatment of death itself that finally, definitively, exhausted their patience. Thanatos, that quiet, dark-winged god of death, came for Sisyphus as he comes for everyone, eventually. And Sisyphus, rather than submit, did something that had never been done before. He tricked Thanatos. he got the god of death to demonstrate the workings of a set of chains. Some accounts say he told Thanatos to try the chains on himself to show how they worked, and then he locked them. He chained death. He kept Thanatos prisoner in his house. And for a time, a strange, suspended, deeply uncomfortable time, no one on earth could die. Soldiers fell in battle and got back up. The elderly and the ill lay in their suffering and could not pass through it. The natural order of the world, that slow and necessary rhythm of ending and beginning, simply stopped. The gods, particularly ours, who found warfare rendered entirely meaningless by the absence of death, were outraged. Eventually ours came to free Thanatos, and Thanatos came, with understandable feeling, for Sisyphus. But Sisyphus had one more trick ready. Before he died, he instructed his wife to perform no funeral rites, to offer no prayers, to leave his body entirely unattended. When he arrived in the underworld and Persephone asked why no rites had been performed, Sisyphus told her, with perfect, shameless confidence, that his wife had been neglectful and disrespectful, and that he should be allowed to return to the living world briefly, just long enough to scold her and arrange proper burial. Persephone, moved by this, let him go. He did not go back. He lived for years more, in the sun, refusing to return, until old age finally took him properly and Hermes was sent personally to escort him below. The punishment assigned to him then has become one of the most resonant images in all of mythology. He was given a boulder and a hill. Every day, for eternity, he pushes the boulder up. The hill is steep, the boulder immense, and the work is exhausting and long. And every time, every single time, just as he nears the top, just as the summit comes within reach, the boulder rolls back down. And he begins again. The ancient sources do not agree on precisely why the boulder always rolls back. Some suggest it is the will of the gods. Some suggest it is simply the nature of the task, designed to be without completion. The philosopher Albert Camus would write, 2,000 years later, that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that the defiance itself, the choosing to push again, is a kind of victory. The Greeks themselves left the question open. Perhaps that is the most honest thing about it. While Sisyphus was scheming against the machinery of death, other stories were playing out in the woods and meadows at the edges of the human world, stories of gods and nymphs, of transformation and longing, of the strange way that pursuit can destroy the very thing it seeks. Pan was not an Olympian. He belonged to a different register of the divine, older, wilder, more elemental. He was the god of shepherds and of wild places, of flocks and of the untamed countryside beyond the cultivated fields. He had the legs and horns of a goat, a broad, cheerful face, and an energy that was simultaneously life-giving and deeply unsettling. He wandered the woods and the hills, playing his pipes, napping in the afternoon heat, and here is where his name enters our language, because when Pan woke suddenly from those afternoon naps, he shouted. He shouted with a voice that rang through the trees and echoed off the rocks, and the sound was so sudden and so enormous and so strange that it sent travelers and animals into instant, unreasoning flight. That particular terror, the sudden overwhelming fear with no clear cause, the fear that seizes the body before the mind has time to ask why, was called, by the Greeks, panic. Pan's fear. It is his word, still, every time that particular cold rush moves through us without warning. The pipes he carried were called the syrinx, and they had their own story, as everything in Greek mythology tends to. There was a nymph named Syrinx, a follower of Artemis, devoted to the wild and to her own independence, who wanted nothing to do with the attentions of gods or anyone else. Pan pursued her through the woods. She ran. She reached the edge of a river and could go no further, and she cried out to the river nymphs for help, and the help they gave her was transformation. She became a cluster of river reeds swaying at the water's edge. Pan, arriving where she had been, found nothing but the marsh grass and the reeds. And when the wind moved through them, they made a sound, a low, breathy, mournful music, entirely unlike anything he had heard before. He cut several of the reeds and bound them together, and he played them, and the music they made was the first panpipes, the syrinx, carrying her name and something of her voice forever after. It is a story with a particular sadness at its center. She escaped him, completely, permanently, and in doing so became the instrument of his most beautiful expression. He plays her still, without knowing it. Echo was another nymph whose story began with something that sounds, at first, like a small infraction. She was a great talker, lively, clever with words, a conversationalist of extraordinary stamina. Hera had taken notice of this, because Echo had a habit of engaging the goddess in long, meandering conversations at precisely the moments when Hera was trying to catch Zeus in one of his many dalliances. Whether Echo did this knowingly, to give the other nymphs time to escape, or simply out of her own natural verbosity, the result was the same. Hera eventually realized what was happening and stripped Echo of her speech. Not entirely. Echo could still use words, but she could no longer choose them. She could only repeat. The last word spoken to her returned without addition or interpretation. Her own voice, the thing that had most defined her, became only an echo of other people's words. She fell in love with Narcissus, that most beautiful and most self-absorbed of mortals, who famously wanted nothing from anyone and fell in love, eventually, with only his own reflection. When Echo found him in the woods and tried to speak to him, she could only repeat what he said back to him. He said, "Is anyone there?" And she said, "Anyone there?" He said, "Come here," and she said, "Come here." He recoiled from her. She was, he felt, mocking him, and she retreated into the hills, fading away from grief until only her voice remained, bouncing off the rocks in valleys and ravines. Still repeating, still answering, still waiting, in her way, for a conversation that never quite comes. From voice to stone, because even the minerals of the earth, in Greek mythology, carry human stories inside them. Amethyst, that deep purple gemstone, has a myth attached to it that is quieter and stranger than most. A young woman named Amethyst was making her way to the temple of Artemis when she caught the attention of Dionysus, god of wine, in one of his less measured moods. She prayed to Artemis for protection, and Artemis answered by turning her to pure, clear crystal, white stone, untouched and untouchable. Dionysus, arriving where she had been, found this crystalline figure, and in some accounts he felt remorse for the desire that had set events in motion. He poured his wine over the stone. The purple seeped into it, staining the crystal deep violet, the color we see in amethyst still. It is a story about protection and its cost. She was saved, yes, but the salvation was its own kind of ending. She became beautiful and permanent and entirely beyond reach. Then there is a story that asks nothing of monsters or punishments or divine power, only of what two people can mean to each other over a long and ordinary life. Baucis and Philemon were an old couple, poor, living in a small cottage in Phrygia. When Zeus and Hermes came to their region disguised as weary travelers, seeking hospitality, they were turned away by every household in the area except one. Baucis and Philemon opened their door. They offered what they had, which was very little, and kept refilling the wine jug, which, they slowly realized with wonder, was refilling itself. The gods revealed themselves. Their neighbors' houses were flooded as punishment for their inhospitality. The old couple's cottage was transformed into a temple, and they were made its guardians. When Zeus asked what they wished for, they asked for only one thing: to die at the same moment, so that neither would ever have to live without the other. The gods honored this. The couple lived on for many years, tending the temple together, and when the time came, they were transformed simultaneously, Baucis into a linden tree, Philemon into an oak, side by side, their branches slowly intertwining above the temple roof. Those who passed could see the two trees grown together, impossible to separate, the bark of one having become, over time, part of the other. It is the most tender transformation in all of mythology. Not a punishment, not an escape, but a kind of completion, love given a form that doesn't end, just changes. And then there is a story with no gods in it at all, or almost none, only a king, a courtier, and a very uncomfortable meal. Dionysius the Elder was the ruler of Syracuse, a powerful and somewhat paranoid man, as tyrants tended to be. One of his courtiers, a man named Damocles, had been effusive in his praise of the king's life. How wonderful, he said, how enviable, to have such power and such wealth and such luxury. Dionysius, with the dry patience of a man who has lived inside that luxury long enough to know its other face, made Damocles an offer. He invited him to sit in the king's own seat, to eat the king's own food, to enjoy everything that power provided. Damocles accepted eagerly. He sat down. The food was magnificent. The wine was exquisite. And then he looked up. Above his head, suspended from the ceiling by a single hair from a horse's tail, was a sword. It hung directly over him, perfectly still, perfectly poised. It had been there all along. Damocles lost his appetite immediately. He asked to be excused from the king's seat and returned, gratefully, to his own. The sword of Damocles has hung in the language ever since, the idea that power and privilege are never free of the thing that could end them, that the higher the seat, the more precarious the tenure that what looks like ease from the outside carries, for those who truly hold it, the constant and unignorable awareness of how quickly it could all come down. One hair. That was all that stood between the feast and the fall. It always is. And so we arrive, at last, at the end of our long walk through the ancient world. We have traveled far tonight. Further, perhaps, than it felt. We stood at the very beginning of things, in the darkness before the Olympians, when a father swallowed his children whole and a mother's love outwitted the whole weight of fate. We watched fire being stolen, not for power, but for warmth. We saw jars opened and labyrinths entered and boulders pushed, again and again, up the same patient hill. We met gods who were jealous and generous and strange, heroes who were brave and broken and persistent, and ordinary people, an old couple, a weeping girl, a nymph dissolved into reeds at the water's edge, whose small, quiet stories turned out to be the ones that lasted longest of all. These stories are very old. Older than the buildings that have crumbled, older than the languages that shifted and changed around them, older than most of the things we consider ancient. And yet here they are, still being told. Still finding their way into dark rooms where someone, tired from the weight of a long day, is ready to set everything down for a while. There is something worth holding on to in that, before you go. The Greeks understood, better than most, that the world is not always fair or kind or comprehensible. Their gods were not perfect. Their heroes did not always win cleanly. Their stories did not always end well, and when they did, the endings were often bittersweet. A couple turned to trees, a nymph turned to stone, a boulder that rolls back before the summit is ever reached. They did not promise that things would be easy. They promised something smaller and more honest than that. They promised that the stories would continue. That there would always be another morning, another attempt, another thread to follow through the dark. You don't need to hold on to any of that right now. It will be there when you wake. For now, let the stories settle. Let them sink down through the surface of things, the way stories do when you're very nearly asleep, becoming less like plot and more like texture, less like words and more like the feeling of words, warm and distant and soft at the edges. Let your breathing slow. Let the room around you go quiet and large. If there are thoughts moving through you, the small anxieties and unfinished business of the day, you can let them pass the way clouds pass, without needing to follow them anywhere. They are not urgent. Nothing is urgent now. The underworld had a river called the Lethe, the river of forgetting. The souls who drank from it let go of everything they had been carrying, every worry, every memory, every weight they had accumulated in their lives, and they rested. Not forever, just long enough. Think of sleep that way tonight. Not as an ending, but as that river. Quiet and dark and cool, moving slowly, asking nothing of you except that you let go. You have done enough today. You have carried what you needed to carry. And now the light is low, and the stories have grown quiet, and somewhere at the edge of things the music is beginning, soft and unhurried, the kind of sound that asks nothing from you, that simply continues, like water, like breathing, like the long slow turning of the world through the night. Let it carry you. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything. You only need to allow the heaviness behind your eyes to mean what it means, and to follow it down, gently, into the dark. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. The stories will be here when you come back. They always are.